Hello, and welcome to a truly boring history, a soft-spoken journey through forgotten corners of the past. Tonight, we'll quietly step into another bleak chapter of history, told not with excitement, but with quiet honesty. If you're just settling in for a peaceful listen before sleep, we'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if this kind of slow, haunting historical storytelling helps you unwind, don't forget to subscribe for more deliberately dull but deeply human stories from long, long ago. Imagine entering the world not in a clean, bright hospital room, but in a dark, smoke-filled wooden longhouse, where the only light comes from a flickering fire that struggles to warm the frozen air around it. You are not greeted by a doctor or by soft hands holding you gently. Instead, you arrive into this life slick with blood, mucus, and the cold breath of Scandinavian winter, caught by your mother's trembling hands and a few worn-out women who've seen more death than birth. Your first breath tastes of smoke and livestock. The longhouse is crowded, not just with people, but with goats, pigs, and chickens that live side by side with your family. The air is thick with the stench of wet wool, human sweat, and manure. There are no blankets made for babies here. Only scraps of animal hide wrapped around your tiny body. No one bathes you. Not yet. Clean water is a luxury. Your skin, still red and raw, is rubbed roughly with cloth that was probably used for someone else not long ago. Perhaps someone who didn't survive their own beginning. Your mother is exhausted. She hasn't eaten well in weeks, and now she lies back against a bundle of straw, her body aching, her eyes barely open. There is no celebration. No flowers, no smiles, only the quiet, heavy silence of people who know that many babies born during winter don't live long enough to be named. Outside, the wind howls across the frozen earth. Snow covers the fields. The sun, if it rises at all, barely touches the village before disappearing again behind clouds that seem to hang low over the world. Inside, the fire at the center of the longhouse is small and shared by everyone. 12, maybe 15 people sleep here, sprawled on straw bedding, wrapped in whatever rags or hides they can find, pressed close together not out of affection, but out of survival. You're too small to have earned a warm spot near the flames. So you sleep near the edge, where the cold bite a little harder, and the straw underneath you is already damp. There are no lullabies, only coughing from the corner, the shuffle of feet across the dirt floor, and the low grumble of a pig settling down beside you. Your body shivers, not knowing yet how to keep its warmth, but the world won't wait for you to learn. Your cries are quiet now. You're too tired. Your first night is not a peaceful one. But then again, peace is not a luxury most people in this village will ever know. You have no name. Not yet. No one dares give you one until they're sure you'll survive. Too many mothers here have named their babies only to bury them days later. Better to wait. Better not to grow too attached. So for now, you're just another child, another tiny life brought into a world that rarely has enough to give. Tomorrow, if you're still breathing, someone might lift you into the weak daylight and whisper a blessing toward the sky, hoping the gods take notice, though they rarely do. And even if they do, there are no guarantees. Odin demands strength. Freya shows little mercy to the weak. And here, in this forgotten corner of the world, the only law is survival. You've only just arrived, and already the world is pressing down on you. You were not born into peace. You were not born into safety. You were born into cold, and mud, and silence. And this is only the beginning. There were no toy stores in your village. There were no bright colors, no carved wooden horses, no soft dolls made with care. There was no concept of childhood as we know it today. You were not raised to play. You were raised to survive. And the world around you made sure you understood that even before you could speak. Your first toy was not really a toy at all. It was most likely a sheep's leg bone, polished smooth over time, maybe by your brother's hand before yours. It wasn't given to you as a gift. It was simply lying on the ground near the hearth, and when you grabbed it, no one took it away. If it didn't hurt you, and it didn't belong to anyone else, then it was yours. That's how ownership worked here. Some children were given bits of leather, worn-out tools, or dull blades that no longer served their original purpose. A bent spoon, a cracked cup, a piece of antler too short to be useful. These things became your companions, not because they sparked your imagination, but because they were the only things you had the strength to lift. There were no bright eyes watching you learn, no applause when you first stood up or took a step, no cheers when you laughed. Your parents were busy. Your older siblings, if you had them, were already working, already feeding animals, carrying firewood, grinding grain. There was no one whose only job was to raise you. That job belonged to everyone and to no one. You learned quickly not to cry without reason. Crying too much meant you be ignored. Crying at night meant you be hushed, not comforted, especially when others were trying to sleep and the fire had died down and the wind had found its way inside through the cracks in the wall. You played alone, or with whatever was nearby. You may have crawled through the dirt floor, your small hands coated in ash and soot. The bones you played with still smelled faintly of the animal they once were, and sometimes you chewed on them. No one stopped you. Teeth would come in soon, and you'd need them for chewing real food, coarse bread, dried fish, tough roots. If you were lucky, outside, when the weather allowed, you might stumble through mud and manure, finding broken tools, animal skulls, or bird feathers. Each one became a discovery, not a treasure, just a distraction. Sometimes other children joined you. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were sick. Sometimes they had died. And sometimes they were just too busy to be children. In the world you were born into, there was no clear line between child and adult. Every year, that line faded more. By the time you could walk steadily, you were already expected to help carry small things. Feed the chickens. Fetch water. Keep quiet. Stay out of the way. Don't die. And so you clung to the only objects that didn't demand anything from you. A crack bowl, a worn-down stick, a sheep's rib bone. Not because they brought you joy, but because they were quiet, and they stayed. And because they didn't leave you, like so many others eventually would. In most parts of the modern world, childhood is seen as sacred, a time of wonder, of games, of gentle protection. But in your Viking village, childhood wasn't something you lived through. It was something you worked through. There was no age where work began. It started when you could stand, and sometimes even earlier. If your legs were strong enough to carry you from one end of the longhouse to the other, then they were strong enough to carry firewood, or to follow the sheep. You didn't go to school. There were no letters to learn, no teachers to encourage you, no classrooms full of warmth and colored chalk. Your education was the rhythm of the day, the sharp bark of your father's voice, the creaking of water buckets, the crackle of dry branches snapping in your arms. Your tasks were small at first, picking herbs, holding a bowl, carrying kindling from one side of the house to the other. But small did not mean easy. Every step outside meant cold or heat or mud or biting wind. And even inside, there was always something that needed to be done. No one praised you for helping. Helping was what you were supposed to do. If you did it wrong, someone would notice. If you did it right, no one would say a word. Your tiny hands were soon covered in scratches and dirt. Your skin cracked in the cold. And there was no time to complain. Pain was common. Hunger was common. You learned not to speak about either. You watched your mother grind barley into meal, day after day, her arms sore, her back bent, and soon your own hands were added to hers, pushing the heavy stones around in slow circles, hour after hour, until you no longer had to be told. Outside, the animals needed feeding. In summer, you'd chase sheep across rough hills. In winter, you'd break ice to bring them water. At first, you followed the older children, imitating what they did. But soon enough, they stopped watching you. You were just expected to know. The line between play and labor blurred completely. That stick you once used as a toy, now it was a tool to herd goats. That game of stacking rocks, now it was a job, clearing stones from a new planting field. There were moments of laughter, but they came and went like flashes of light between long shadows. And even when you laughed, part of you stayed alert. For the cold, for the animals, for the unpredictable moods of the adults around you. And when you fell into mud, into thorns, into the freezing river, you didn't cry. Or, if you did, you made sure no one heard you. because tears didn't fix things. Tears didn't bring warmth. Tears didn't bring food. Every day that passed made you a little stronger and a little harder. You didn't become a worker. You became work itself. And in time, no one could remember the last time you were small enough to be carried, because now you carried things. Your body, your tasks, your silence. This was life, and you were learning it before you even knew how to live. There are many kinds of discomfort in the world. Hunger, cold, pain. But few things compare to the quiet misery of needing to relieve yourself in the middle of the night during a Viking winter. There was no bathroom in the house. There were no buckets, no warm toilet seats, no candles guiding your way. There was just the wind, the ice, and the outhouse, if your village even had one. More likely, it was simply a pit behind the longhouse, dug during the warmer months, now partially frozen, half buried in snow, surrounded by brittle weeds and the footprints of wild animals. When your body called, you didn't have a choice. You'd rise from your straw bedding, your skin already shaking from the cold, your breath visible in the darkness. Every step toward the outside world was a punishment. Your bare feet touched the frozen floorboards, then the dirt, then the snow. There was no one to help you, no parent to guide you, just the door and the wind beyond it. You pushed the wooden plank open, and instantly, the air hit you like knives. The darkness outside was almost complete. The moon might have been out, but it made no difference. Your fingers went numb first, then your nose, your ears, your toes. Each step was slow, painful. Your muscles clenched in the cold, but there was no time to wait. The longer you delayed, the worse it got. And when you finally reached the spot, a hole, a trench, a space carved from frozen earth, you squatted, shivering, exposed to the night, afraid to touch anything, afraid to lose your balance. The cold pressed into places you didn't know could feel cold. There was no wiping, no washing, only the wind and the darkness, and the quiet shame of being alive in such a place. Sometimes you were too small to go alone, but even then, no one wanted to accompany you. So you learned early how to suffer in silence. And when it was done, when you finished your task and stumbled back toward the house, your legs were stiffer than before, your face burned from the chill, and your hands were so numb they could barely push open the heavy door again. You'd crawl back into the straw, trembling, teeth clenched. No one asked where you'd gone. No one offered comfort. This was normal. This was expected. Every night in a Viking village was a test. And the simple act of using the toilet was just another small battle in a life made of endless struggle. You never forgot it, because it happened again, and again, and again, until the cold no longer shocked you. It simply became a part of you, like the hunger, like the dirt, like the silence in a Viking village. Sickness did not arrive as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet presence that slowly consumed the body and dimmed the spirit. It did not matter how old you were, how strong you had once been, or how deeply your family loved you. Illness came for everyone eventually, and when it did, there was nothing heroic about it. Only silence waiting in the slow unraveling of life. When you first felt the weakness in your limbs, it was subtle. You might have woken up a little later than usual, noticed the ache in your joints, or the way your breath felt just a bit heavier. But no one noticed right away, because life in the village was already hard, and everyone lived with some kind of pain. If you were a child, they told you to keep moving. If you were an adult, you simply pushed through. Complaining was a waste of energy. But by the second or third day, the fire in your body could not be ignored. A fever would take hold, burning not with warmth, but with a terrifying kind of heat that leaves your skin drenched and your hands shaking. You would lie down on your straw bedding, your back damp with sweat, staring up at the wooden beams of the longhouse, unable to tell if it was day or night. There were no doctors, no potions that could be trusted, no measured doses or sterile remedies. Sometimes a neighbor would bring herbs or boiled bark. Other times your mother would crush leaves into a paste and whisper a prayer to the old gods as she pressed it to your chest. But no one truly believed it would cure you. These were rituals, not remedies. Gestures of comfort in a world that offered none. People didn't talk about death openly, but they saw it often enough to recognize when it was coming. The signs were clear. Shallow breathing, cold hands, that distant look in the eyes as though the soul was already partway gone. Children knew what it meant when someone in the house stopped speaking, when a bowl of broth was left untouched, when the fire was kept lit all night, not for warmth, but for watching. The worst part of sickness wasn't always the pain. It was the waiting. You lay there, hour after hour, with nothing to do but feel your body betray you. The cough grew deeper, your head heavier, and the world around you faded into soft, muted shapes. Sometimes you would hear voices nearby, but they sounded far away, like echoes bouncing off stone. Your name might be spoken, but you couldn't answer. You were still alive, but you were already vanishing. And if you were a child, this moment was all the more cruel. You hadn't even lived long enough to understand what was happening. You only knew that you were cold when you should have been warm, thirsty when you couldn't drink, tired in a way that rest never helped. You saw your mother's face lean close, her eyes full of fear she wouldn't speak aloud. And then, perhaps, you didn't see anything at all. Sometimes you recovered. The fever broke. Your body found its strength again, and the people around you moved on without a word. No one celebrated survival. They simply expected you to return to work, to fetch water, to feed animals, to gather wood. Life did not pause for those who nearly died. It barely even noticed them. But sometimes you didn't recover. And when that happened, the silence afterward was even quieter than before. Your body was wrapped in cloth, taken outside before the frost made the earth too hard to dig. There was no ceremony, no stone to mark the spot, no story written in your name. You became part of the village's memory, not as someone who lived, but as someone who no longer did. In the Viking world, sickness was not a moment of crisis. It was a slow, helpless descent into stillness. It came often and it left few untouched. And whether it took you or spared you, it always left something behind. An emptiness, a silence, a reminder that in this world, life itself was always temporary. In the village where you were born, food was never something to look forward to. It was not pleasure. It was not joy. It was a necessity, something consumed in silence, quickly, without ceremony. And for most of your life, that food came in the form of one thing: gruel. Every morning, the same pot was hung above the hearth. Inside it, a thin mixture of barley, oats, water, and maybe, if the season was kind, a sliver of animal fat or a few drops of milk. It boiled slowly over the fire, not because it needed to be slow, but because there was little else to cook. The smell was neither appetizing nor offensive. It was simply there, thick, bland, and inescapable. It filled the longhouse, soaked into the walls, clung to your clothes. It was a scent of survival. As a child, you didn't ask what was for breakfast. You already knew. It was the same thing you had yesterday and the day before that. Sometimes, if food was scarce, you ate yesterday's gruel again, left in the pot overnight, reheated until the crust on the sides softened just enough to scrape clean. No one complained. Complaining about food was a luxury for people who had choices. You had none. When you were small, someone would feed you by hand. A wooden spoon dipped in the pot, lifted to your mouth, hot and thick and flavorless. It filled your belly, but it never satisfied you. It never gave you warmth or joy. It simply stopped the hunger for a little while. And in the world you lived in, that was more than enough. On rare days, when a fish had been caught or an animal slaughtered, a piece of meat might be added to the pot. But you were never the first to be served. The oldest ate first. The strongest, the ones who needed to work the hardest. By the time the spoon reached you, the best parts were already gone. You learned not to expect anything. You learned to be grateful for the bottom of the pot. There was no sugar, no spices. Salt was precious, used sparingly, if at all. Sweetness was something whispered about, remembered by those who had traded with faraway lands, but never tasted by children like you. Every meal tasted like with smoke and damp grain. Every mouthful reminded you that food was not for pleasure. It was for staying alive. You ate quickly, not because you were in a hurry, but because the cold seeped into everything, and a warm bowl of gruel was the only heat you'd feel that day. The fire couldn't reach everyone in the house, but the pot could. It passed from hand to hand, leaving behind warmth in your fingers, if not in your heart. By evening, you were hungry again, but there was no second meal waiting. Sometimes, if there were scraps, the pot would be refilled with water, stretched thinner, stirred again. But often, you simply went to sleep hungry, listening to your stomach protest as you curled beneath animal skins, dreaming of meals you would never have. There were stories, of course, stories of feasts in the halls of the gods, tables overflowing with roasted meat, jugs of honeyed mead, baskets of bread. You heard them whisper by the old ones by the fire, their voices thick with longing. But those were dreams for the dead. You were still among the living. And among the living, there was only gruel. Every day, every season, every year of your growing life. You didn't hate it. You couldn't afford to. Hatred was too much energy. Instead, you accepted it. The same way you accepted the cold. The same way you accepted the silence. Because in the end, a bowl of gruel was not something you loved or remembered. It was simply what kept you here. Winter in a Viking village was not a season. It was a sentence. A slow, silent trial that tested your will to keep breathing with each frozen morning and every longer, darker night. It came early, often without warning, and it stayed longer than anyone ever hoped it would. It arrived like a shadow and moved through every part of your life. Your food, your body, your sleep, your thoughts. The sky dimmed day by day, and then barely rose at all. The sun became a memory, a pale light on the horizon that never seemed to touch your skin. For most of the winter months, it felt like the world had forgotten to wake up, as if you were trapped beneath a lid of clouds, cold and unmovable. Inside the longhouse, the fire never went out, but it never seemed to be enough. You could sit right beside it and still feel the frost in your toes, the chill in your bones. The heat from the flames only reached a few feet in each direction, and the rest of the space, where you slept, where you sat, where you huddled against the wall, remained bitter and unmoved. Cold air crept through the smallest cracks in the wood, and when the wind howled, it sounded like something alive was outside, circling the walls, looking for a way in. Your breath came out in mist, even indoors. Your fingers cracked open and bled from the dryness, and your feet stung constantly from contact with the frozen floor. Blankets were few, and they smelled of wet fur and old smoke. At night, you lay between bodies, not for comfort, but for warmth. There was no space for modesty. No shame in pressing yourself against your siblings or your parents, or even the animals that slept in the same room. Warmth was everything. Warmth was survival. Water had to be broken open from ice each morning. The act of drinking, something so simple in other seasons, became a chore that numbed your hands and made your teeth ache. You rationed firewood, stretching each log as far as it could go. If the fire went out in the middle of the night, you didn't relight it right away. You just waited for the sun, or what little of it there was. Hunger followed closely behind the cold. By the middle of winter, food stores were low. Dried fish, hardened bread. If there had been a slaughter in autumn, you might have meat. If not, you made do with broth and gruel, thinner now than before. You could feel your ribs more clearly with each week. You saw it in others, too. Cheeks sinking, eyes dulling, movement slowing. Winter took its toll, even when no one spoke of it. Illness, always present, grew stronger in the cold. A cough that started in early December might last until February, or until the person no longer had the strength to cough at all. You didn't ask if someone was getting better. You waited to see if they stood up again. And outside, the world disappeared. The ground was buried under snow and ice. Trees groaned in the wind. Roads vanished. The forest, once a place for hunting or gathering, became unreachable. The sea froze or churned so violently that no boat dared go near it. You were trapped inside your home, inside your body, inside the season. Children didn't play in the snow, not in this kind of winter. There were no games, no snowmen, no laughter, just chores, carrying water, feeding animals, huddling together, staying quiet, wishing the sun would return. And the worst part of it all was that this was normal. This wasn't disaster. This was simply what winter was. Year after year, you didn't wait for rescue. You didn't dream of escape. You waited only for spring. And even that, you waited for carefully. Because not everyone did. Some people didn't survive the long night. And when the snow finally melted, you could still feel the absence of those who were gone. In the silence around the fire. In the extra space on the sleeping mat. In the breath you took without realizing you were holding it. Winter didn't kill loudly. It killed slowly. With cold. With hunger. With quiet. And when it ended, it didn't leave you whole. It left you tired, hollow, and grateful, not because you had truly lived, but because you had simply lasted. Growing up in a Viking village meant learning to live with silence. An empty, heavy kind of silence that filled the spaces between labor and sleep. There were people all around you, but that didn't mean you were never alone. In truth, most of your childhood was spent on the edges of conversations, of warmth, of notice. And in those quiet stretches of time, when you were too young to work yet too old to cry, your only real companions were the animals you were told to watch. Goats, mostly. They weren't cuddly. They weren't kind. They didn't follow you around like pets or wait by the door when you came home. They butted you with their heads, chewed on your clothes, wandered away when you needed them to stay still. But they were there, and in a world that often felt cold and indifferent, their presence was something you could count on. You were given your first herding duty before you could even count properly. Someone would place a stick in your hand and point toward a cluster of animals in the yard, already shifting restlessly in the cold. You weren't expected to do much. Just follow them. Keep them from wandering into the woods. Bring them back when the sun dipped too low. But even that small task pulled you away from the house, from a fire, from the muffled sounds of adults moving through their day. The goats didn't speak, but you often did. You talked to them when no one else was around, whispering stories you barely understood, mimicking the voices of your parents, humming songs without words. You knew they didn't listen, but you talked anyway, because the quiet was too heavy, and the days were too long. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, you hoped that the goats stayed near you. It meant you weren't truly forgotten. You watched them more closely than you watch people. You noticed which ones limped, which ones always tried to climb things, which ones never left the side of the others. You gave them names in your mind, though you never said them out loud. Naming things was dangerous. If something had a name, it could be lost. And if it was lost, it would hurt more. Sometimes, you curled up beside them when the wind was too harsh and your body too tired to stand. Their warmth wasn't comforting, exactly, but it was real. It was more than you got from most people, and that was enough. You could hear their breathing, steady and loud, and feel the roughness of their fur against your skin. They smelled like dirt and grass and old sweat, but so did everything else. At least the goats didn't ask anything from you except to be near. As you got older, you began to understand why no one spent time with you. Everyone was working. Everyone was tired. The village didn't have the luxury of affection. There were no bedtime stories, no games, no soft conversations to fill the evenings. Life was built on silence, and you were expected to carry that silence like everyone else. But the goats didn't care if you were too quiet. They didn't notice if you were sad. They didn't scold you when you sat down instead of standing. They simply grazed, wandered, and occasionally brushed past you without a sound. And in that quiet contact, you found a strange kind of companionship. One that didn't demand, didn't question, didn't leave. Of course, some of them died. They always did. Illness, winter, wolves. You were never warned. One day they were there, the next day they weren't. And no one explained what happened. They just disappeared. And you were expected to move on. You did. You always did. But not without a little more weight in your chest, a little more distance in your eyes, a little more understanding that in this world, everything leaves eventually, even the things you never thought would matter. So you stopped naming them. You stopped talking so much. You learned to be still, to listen, to wait, and in time, you stopped needing even the goats. Because silence, once unbearable, became something you carried inside you, like hunger, like cold, like the memory of warmth that never stayed long enough to keep. By the time you turned 10, no one called you a child anymore. There was no birthday celebration, no soft moment to mark the passage of time. You simply became older, and with age came expectation, not of knowledge, but of readiness. Not to speak well or to think clearly, but to kill. Killing wasn't spoken of as something heroic or noble. It was a skill no different than chopping wood or gutting fish. Necessary, functional. If you were a boy, it was expected. If you were a girl, it was feared, though some learned it anyway. In the Viking world, strength was not admired from afar. It was demanded up close, tested in blood and bone. Your first weapon wasn't a sword. It was probably a stick or a worn-down wooden spear, dulled at the tip. You didn't begin by fighting people. You started with animals, birds, rabbits, creatures you were told not to pity. Their deaths were part of your survival, part of the food on the table. But no one asked if you were ready to watch life leave a body. No one asked if it haunted your dreams. They just handed you the tool and said, try. At first, your hands trembled, not from fear of being hurt, but from the strangeness of hurting something else. The weight of that moment didn't show on your face, but it stayed in your chest. The sound of the neck snapping, the twitching legs, the silence afterward. It all settled into you, quietly like the cold. And like the cold, you learned to live with it. You didn't train in neat rows like soldiers in stories. There were no drills, no uniforms, no cheers when you struck well. Training meant watching the older boys spar, then being pushed into it yourself, often without warning. You were hit before you understood how to defend yourself. You were bruised before you learned what pain really was. If you cried, they told you to stop. If you bled, they told you to use it. And still, you came back the next day. Because strength was survival, and survival was the only prize anyone offered. You learned to aim not for the body, but for the soft places, behind the knee, under the ribs, across the throat. These weren't secrets. They were lessons, passed down not in words, but in bruises, in missing teeth, in scars that stayed long after the fight was over. Sometimes you practiced on trees, swinging your blade into bark until your arms gave out. Sometimes you fought other boys, just to prove you weren't weak. Sometimes the practice became real. A stranger came to the village. A raid went badly. A wild animal got too close. And in those moments, there was no time to ask questions. You either used what you had learned, or you didn't return home. No one congratulated you the first time you killed something bigger than a rabbit. They only nodded or maybe said nothing at all. The silence was worse than the blood, because it meant that what had once been unthinkable had now become normal. You began to see people differently, not as voices or faces or names, but as movements, as threats. You watched where they kept their knives, how they stood, whether they looked you in the eye, not because you were planning anything, but because you were taught that danger could live in anyone, even someone you had shared a meal with the night before. And in your dreams, sometimes you still heard the screams. Not loud, not violent, just short, cut off too soon. The sound of something ending. The sound of something inside you shifting into something colder, harder, less afraid. By the time you were 12, you no longer remember what it felt like to live without the weight of steel in your hand. Your fingers had calluses. Your arms carried memory. You didn't think of yourself as a child because no one around you did. You were not innocent. You were not protected. You were something sharper, not because you chose to be, but because the world had no use for anything else. If you were born a daughter in a Viking village, your life began with a quiet kind of invisibility. No one celebrated your birth with the same hope they might offer a son. There were no dreams of raids or conquest spoken over your sleeping form. Instead, your arrival was met with silent calculation. Another mouth to feed, another set of hands that someday would wash, cook, sew, and bear children. You were not unwanted, but your presence came with limits already written before you ever spoke your first word. From the beginning, you learned to make yourself small. You were taught to listen more than you spoke, to keep your eyes lowered and your questions to yourself. When the boys were handed sticks to mimic swords, you were handed cloth to fold. When they were taken to the woods to learn to kill, you were taken to the hearth to learn to serve. The message was never spoken aloud, but it was everywhere. Your value was in how well you could care for others, not in how well you could carry yourself. You worked just as hard as the boys, sometimes harder, but your labor was never framed as strength. It was expectation. You scrubbed pots until your knuckles cracked, carried water until your back ached, plucked feathers, peeled roots, stirred thick porridge over the fire until your arms burned. No one applauded. No one helped. This was your place, and to question it would only bring silence, or worse, shame. As you grew, your world did not expand. It narrowed. Your body became a thing to be prepared, shaped, and guarded. Your mother began to show you how to walk properly, how to dress modestly, how to carry yourself in front of men. You were told to be kind, to be obedient, to be useful, not for your own sake, but so that one day someone might choose to marry you, because in the eyes of the village, your worth would ultimately be measured by whose wife you became and how many children you could bear. There was no room for defiance, no language for rebellion. If you questioned the rules, you were scolded. If you resisted, you were punished. If you showed signs of independence, they warned you that no man would ever want you. So you adapted. You learned to nod. You learned to keep your thoughts inside your own mind. You learned to endure. But even silence didn't protect you. You watched older girls taken from their homes. Some married off before their voices had even stopped changing. Others sent away to serve in households not their own, treated as something between a guest and a servant. You saw how quickly their names were forgotten, how easily their lives were consumed by those around them. And you understood that your time would come too, not because you wanted it, but because wanting was never part of the equation. Sometimes you wonder what it felt like to be free, free to run without care, to shout without consequence, to be heard, to be seen. But these thoughts were dangerous, and you held them quietly, like embers in the cold. You knew that your future was not built on dreams, but on endurance. You would become a wife. You would become a mother. You would bury children. You would grow old before you ever felt young. And yet, through all of this, you survived. Not because life was gentle with you, but because you learned how to carry pain without showing it. You learned how to stay still when you wanted to run, how to keep your dignity when others try to take it. You learned that being a daughter in the village meant learning to carry the weight of everyone else's comfort on your back, in your hands, and most of all, in your silence. You were not weak. You were never weak. You were simply never allowed to be anything else. You would think that when someone important arrived in your village, the people would rejoice, would gather, would offer smiles and open hands. But that was not how it worked in your world. In a Viking village, when word spread that a jarl, or worse, his men, were on their way, the air in the longhouse changed. The fire still burned, but the warmth was gone. Faces grew tense. Voices dropped lower. Work stopped not because there was nothing to do, but because no one wanted to be noticed. Because when the jarls visited, you didn't come out to greet them. You found a place to disappear. Jarls were lords in name, but not in kindness. They ruled through force, wealth, and reputation, and their presence often brought more fear than honor. Their cloaks were clean, their boots heavy, their expressions unreadable. They did not walk through villages to offer help or to share food. They came to collect taxes, tribute, men for raids, women for service, children, sometimes for reasons never spoken aloud. No one told you to hide when they arrived. You simply learned it from the way your mother looked out the doorway, the way your father stood a little straighter, the way the elders fell completely silent. As a child, you didn't fully understand what made them dangerous. You only felt in your chest a heaviness that pressed down harder with every approaching footstep. You would crawl into the darkest corner of the house, behind a stack of furs or under a wooden bench, anywhere their eyes couldn't reach. You pressed your body into the cold earth, holding your breath, praying that no one would remember you were there. And even when they left the room, even when you heard the door close again, you waited, not because it was over, but because fear always took longer to leave than the thing that caused it. If you were lucky, their visit was short. They took some meat, a skin of ale, a promise of loyalty, and moved on. But sometimes they stayed. Sometimes they demanded more. You saw them take bread from your mother's hands, speak to her without kindness, without looking at her face. You saw them nod toward your sister, and no one said anything. And when she returned the next morning, if she returned at all, her eyes didn't look at anyone, and no one asked where she had been. Your father didn't raise his voice. He knew better. Resistance was punished swiftly and publicly. You had heard of villages burned for refusing tribute. You had heard of men who spoke too boldly, only to be dragged away and left in the woods, or hung from trees where everyone could see. Power in your world was not a shield. It was a blade, held just above your head, never knowing when it would fall. So you stayed quiet. You learned how to be invisible, how to step lightly, how to look down when someone looked at you. You learned how to bury your anger so deep inside your chest that not even you could find it. And when the Jarls finally left, when the sound of their horses disappeared into the distance, the village didn't celebrate. It exhaled, slowly, carefully, and then everyone went back to their work, pretending they had not been afraid. But the fear never truly left. It stayed in the corners of the longhouse, in the hollowness of the firelight, in the silence that settled over the evening meal, because you knew they would come again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but eventually. And when they did, you would hide again, not because you were a coward, but because in your world, survival meant knowing when to be small, when to be quiet, and when to disappear. You never expected your friend to die, not because death was rare. It wasn't. You had seen animals fall, seen old people fade, heard stories whisper about children who didn't wake up. But when it happened to someone who laughed with you the day before, someone who ran beside you in the mud, someone whose voice still echoed in your ears, it didn't feel like a part of life. It felt like something had broken, quietly, permanently. His name wasn't written anywhere, but you remembered it because it was spoken often by his mother in the mornings, by the older boys when they teased him, by you when you called out across the field, asking if you wanted to climb the old stump or race down the hill after the goats. He was small for his age, but fast. He laughed with his whole body. He didn't always follow the rules, but he always shared his food when he had enough. You thought you would grow up together, like your fathers had, like the men in the village who shared the same scars and stories and jokes. But then the cough started. At first, no one worried. Children coughed all the time. The air was thick with smoke and damp with cold, and everyone had something rattling in their chest by midwinter. He still played, still laughed, still chased you through the trees. But after a few days, he slowed. His eyes looked heavier, his steps shorter. You noticed him stop more often, pressing his hand to his ribs, breathing like the air didn't quite reach him anymore. One morning, he didn't come outside. You waited by the tree near the edge of the pasture, the place you always met. The sun moved across the sky, and he never came. The next day, you went to his house, and his mother met you at the door. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes were red, and her hands were shaking, and behind her, you could hear the sound of that cough, sharp and wet and wrong. You weren't allowed inside, not because anyone thought it would help, but because by then everyone knew he wasn't getting better. The fever had come, and with it came the weight of knowing that nothing more could be done. No herbs, no prayers, just waiting. You came back the next day anyway. You sat outside, your back against the wall, listening. The coughing had changed. It was slower now, weaker, like each breath had to be convinced to stay. No one came to tell you to go home. No one brought food. No one said anything. Grief had already arrived, and it sat in the doorway like a second shadow. And then, on the fourth day, there was silence. Not the silence of rest. Not the kind that comes after a long sleep. It was a silence that makes the air feel heavier, that makes the house feel colder, that makes your own breath sound too loud in your ears. You knew, everyone did, when you walked back through the village. No one asked you what had happened. They simply stepped aside. They knew where you had been. There was no funeral, no gathering, just a hurried burial behind the trees, wrapped in cloth, placed in earth that still held the bite of frost. You stood a few steps away, unsure if you were supposed to cry, unsure if you were even allowed to. No one else did. His father placed a hand on your shoulder for a moment, brief, firm, and wordless, and then walked away. The days after felt strange. You still woke up early, still did your chores, still saw the tree where you used to meet. But something in the rhythm of the village had shifted, like a drum that now beat slightly off time. And in the silence, your mind played old sounds. His laugh, his footsteps, the way he shouted your name across the yard, the way you always thought there would be another day. But there wasn't. You didn't talk about him anymore. Not because you forgot, but because no one else brought him up. And in the world you lived in, remembering out loud only made things harder. So you remembered quietly, in the way you sat by the fire, in the way you looked at the field where you used to play, in the way you stood alone and didn't complain. That was the lesson the village taught you. Not how to stop loss, but how to carry it, without words, without sound, without leaving space for it to grow too loud. You didn't forget your friend, but you learned to live around the space he left behind, because you had no other choice. You learned to walk not on smooth ground, but on frozen dirt, cracked wood, and sharp stones. There were no sandals waiting by the door, no soft leather boots stitched for comfort. If you were lucky, there might be something, a scrap of hide, a worn pair passed down from an older sibling, soles already thin from too many winters. But more often than not, you walked barefoot. Not because you wanted to, because there was no other choice. The ground in your village was never warm. Even in summer, the mornings held a chill that crept up from the earth, curling around your ankles before the sun had time to rise. In autumn, that chill grew sharper, biting into your heels and toes like tiny teeth. And then winter came, not as a surprise, but as a certainty. The earth turned to ice. The wind howled. The snow buried paths, and your feet, small, cracked, bloodied, were sent out into it anyway. You didn't walk carefully. There was no time for that. You carried water, fed animals, hauled wood, chased goats across frozen fields, all with the sting of cold anchoring itself in your skin. At first, the pain was sharp. Each step on the frostbitten ground felt like fire and knives, like punishment. But after a while, the pain dulled and then disappeared, replaced by a numbness that was worse than pain, because you knew what it meant. It meant your body was giving up, that your blood had stopped reaching your toes, that damage was already happening. Even if you couldn't feel it yet, your feet were always dirty, always bruised, always marked by small cuts and splinters. Sometimes you tore skin open on ice or rock, and it bled for hours, seeping into the cold until the wound stiffened and crusted shut. You didn't treat it. There was no ointment, no clean bandage, no fire-warm cloth to soothe the sting. You kept walking, because you had to. At night, when you lay by the fire, you rubbed your feet to bring them back to life, though life came slowly and always with pain. The tingling was unbearable, needles beneath the skin, as if the cold itself were fighting not to leave. Sometimes your toes turned blue. Sometimes they swelled. Sometimes they simply stopped moving the way they should. But no one worried, not unless you couldn't stand. And even then, they'd wait to see if you could by morning. No one pitied you. Everyone's feet hurt. Even the adults winced when they stood up too quickly, when they stepped into snow before the boots were passed around. It was normal. Pain was normal. And when something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. You tried not to cry, not because tears were shameful, but because they froze too fast, stinging your cheeks before you could wipe them away. You learned to breathe slowly through the discomfort, to press your heel to the warmest part of the fire pit when no one was looking, to hide the way your toes curled inward from the cold. Some winters were worse than others. You heard stories of children who lost toes, whose skin blackened, whose feet never healed properly. You heard the older ones talk about a boy from another village who died after falling into a frozen stream. Not because he drowned, but because his body never got warm again. You believed every word, because nothing about the cold felt exaggerated. It was always worse than words could explain. And still, each day you walked, through snowdrifts, across frozen mud, over splintered wood and brittle straw. Not because you wanted to, but because life demanded it. Because the goats had to be fed, the fire had to be kept alive, and your pain was not an excuse. So your feet kept moving, through the numbness, through the blood, through the frost, until even the cold stopped being something you noticed and became something you simply were. There was a kind of silence in your village that didn't belong to the wind or the snow. It came without warning, heavier than the cold, thicker than night. It began in the eyes of the adults, how they paused just for a second when they heard something in the distance. The clink of metal, the murmur of hooves, the shout that didn't belong to anyone they knew. It was not loud, not at first, but it was enough. And once it came, that silence spread like smoke, filling every corner of the longhouse, pushing down on your chest, telling you without words that danger was near. You learned early that not all violence came from beasts or blizzards. Some of it came on horseback, with fire and iron, with laughter that sounded more like a threat than joy. You didn't need to be told the word for a raid. You felt it in the way your mother gripped your arm, in the way your father stood still with his axe in hand, not moving, not speaking. You saw it in how the doors were barred, how the older children were told to stay inside, how everyone's breath became shallow, waiting not for the sound to grow louder, but for it to stop entirely. Raids didn't always come from faraway lands. Sometimes they came from people who spoke the same language, who dressed the same, who believed in the same gods. Other villages, rival clans, hungry men, desperate men, or simply cruel ones. There were no rules, no warnings. Sometimes they came for food, sometimes for livestock, sometimes for nothing at all. Sometimes they came just because they could, and when they did, everything you thought was yours, your safety, your home, your name, suddenly felt like something that could be taken. The fire you huddled beside could be kicked over. The bed you shared with your brother could be burned. The goats you cared for could be slaughtered or stolen. And if they saw you, truly saw you, your body could be taken, your life ripped from its place and thrown into the hands of strangers. You remember the first time it happened, not as an explosion of violence, but as a slow unraveling. The noises came closer. The shouting became clearer. Someone cried out in the distance, and then everything moved at once. Your mother pulled you into the darkest part of the longhouse, threw fur over your head, told you not to move, not to make a sound, no matter what happened. You obeyed, because her voice was shaking, and you had never heard that before. Through the gaps in the wood, you saw boots. Muddy, heavy, you saw fire reflecting in the steel of weapons, the blur of movement as something was knocked over. Someone pulled to the ground. You stayed silent, because silence was the only thing that might keep you alive. And even when the footsteps faded, even when the voices moved away, you didn't come out. Not right away. Because you didn't trust the quiet. Because quiet didn't always mean safety. When the smoke cleared and the door finally opened, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something had changed. Something permanent. You walked outside and saw the ash where the shed used to be. You saw the broken fence. You saw blood in the snow. Not yours, but someone's. You didn't ask who. You didn't want to know. The fear didn't leave with them. It stayed, curled in your stomach like cold water. It followed you in your chores, in your sleep, in the way you jumped at sudden sounds. And the worst part was knowing it would happen again. Not today, maybe not this week, but eventually. The roads were always open. The world outside your village was always hungry. So you learned to keep your head down. You learned which trees to hide behind. You memorized the feel of the ground beneath your bare feet, so you could run in the dark without falling. You learned how to listen, not just for words, but for danger, for silence, for change, because in your world, peace was never promised. Safety was never real. The walls of your home were thin, and the hands that held you could be torn away in a single night. You didn't pray for the raids to stop. You knew better. You prayed that the next time they came, they wouldn't look in your direction. And if they did, you prayed you'd be fast enough to vanish. Night was not a time of peace in your village. It was not a place of dreams or safety. It was a long, stretched-out silence where every sound carried too far, where every shadow felt larger than it should, and where the line between what was real and what lived only in your fear became too thin to see. When the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the walls of the longhouse like a living thing, you knew the night was about to speak. and you hoped it would not say your name. The longhouse was crowded, but not warm. You slept between bodies, siblings, parents, even animals, but closeness didn't bring comfort. It only made the silence feel more fragile. You could hear everything. The shift of straw under someone's weight, the cracking of the fire, the long, slow breath of someone drifting into sleep, or worse, the short, rapid breath of someone trying not to cry. And then came the screams. Sometimes they started as murmurs, barely louder than the wind. A child turning in sleep, caught in a dream they couldn't wake from. Other times, they broke out suddenly, cutting to the dark like a blade, sharp and desperate. It wasn't always clear who they came from or why, but you knew better than to ask. Sometimes it was the old man who had seen too much war. Sometimes it was your neighbor's daughter who had gone missing for a day and come back quieter than before. Sometimes it was your own brother, twisting beside you, caught in something you couldn't see, and could only shake him with your hand on his shoulder and your own whisper in his ear, telling him to come back. You never screamed. Or, if you did it quietly, into the fur wrapped around your face, into your own hand. You learned not to wake others. Not because they would hurt you, but because everyone was tired, and no one wanted to be reminded that they were just as scared as you. And there were other sounds. 2. The sound of someone being struck, not in anger, but in control. A voice raised not in conversation, but in warning. A mother scolding too sharply. A father returning from drink. A door creaking open in the middle of the night, when no one should be coming or going. You heard things that were never spoken about in the morning. And you learned early which noises were not to be repeated, which stories would be swallowed and carried in silence. The screams weren't always human. Sometimes they came from the forest, a howl too close, an animal caught in something, or something catching it. You imagine wolves outside the walls. Imagine their eyes watching through the cracks. You told yourself they wouldn't come inside, but part of you wasn't sure. Part of you wondered if the screams were not warnings, but invitations. And then there were the nights when no one screamed. Nights when everything was too quiet. When even the fire seemed to burn without sound, when the goats didn't stir, and your breath felt loud in your ears. Those nights were worse, because you didn't know what was being held back. You didn't know what waited just beyond hearing. You lay there, eyes open in the dark, listening for something, anything, to break the stillness, unsure whether you wanted it to or not. Because the truth was, screaming meant someone was still alive. Screaming meant someone still cared enough to be afraid. It was the silence after the scream that haunted you, the quiet that told you whatever had been feared had already arrived. And all you could do was close your eyes, hold your breath, and hope that when the morning came, your name would still be spoken, your place still warm, your silence still yours. Because in the Viking night, there were no promises, only the dark, and whatever waited inside it. There were no days off in your village, no rest days, no holidays marked with joy or meals that lasted longer than a few minutes. Every day was the same, cold, gray, demanding, and it began before the sun even found the strength to rise. You didn't wait to be told what to do. You already knew. The same tasks you had done yesterday would need doing again, and the day after that, and every day after that, until your body failed or the world changed, which it never did. You woke not to the sound of birds or laughter, but to the scrape of feet on the floor, to the clatter of wood being moved, to the sharp bark of someone calling a name, maybe yours, or maybe your siblings. You blinked into half-darkness, felt the weight of sleep still pulling at your limbs, and pushed yourself up anyway. The air was cold. The straw beneath you smelled of sweat and soil. And the fire, if it hadn't gone out completely, was barely glowing. The first task was always the fire. Someone had to feed it, breathe life back into it, or else the rest of the day would begin in frozen silence. You took the axe or the knife, or just your hands if that was all you had, and you brought what fuel you could find. Wet branches, splintered beams, dung if nothing else remained. The smoke that rose from the rekindled flames wasn't warm. It stung your eyes, clung to your hair, and filled your chest with a heaviness that never left. Then came water. The buckets were heavy, made heavier by frost, and the path to the stream was slippery with ice or sticky with mud, depending on the season. You walked it alone, or with someone else who didn't speak. There was no time for conversation, only cold fingers, aching backs, and the slow journey back with buckets that spilled if you weren't careful. And if you spilled, you went again. You fed the animals next. Goats, chickens, maybe a pig if your family was lucky. They were loud, impatient, and smelled worse than you did, but they were valuable, so they had to be cared for. You scattered grain with numb hands. You broke open frozen troughs. You chased them when they wandered, herded them when they resisted, cleaned after them when no one else would. You didn't stop to rest because there was always something else. Inside the longhouse, the work never paused. Grinding grain, stirring gruel, scraping skins, washing cloth that never truly became clean. You helped where you were told. You watched your elders with tired eyes and mimicked their movements. You were rarely praised. Praise was not part of the day. The best you could hope for was a nod, or nothing at all, which often meant you hadn't done it wrong. There were no games between chores. No time to catch your breath. If someone caught you sitting, they gave you something else to carry. If you lingered too long near the door, you were sent outside. And if you said you were tired, they laughed or ignored you. Everyone was tired. Children, adults, even the dogs. Tiredness was not special. It was just another thing you carried. The sun, when it came, moved slowly across the sky. But the day felt shorter than you expected, because the list of things to do never grew smaller. The more you worked, the more you noticed what else had to be done. A hole in the roof, a dull blade, a torn sleeve, and no one else was going to fix it. Not unless you did. Evening came not with rest, but with another round of the same. More firewood, more animals to check, more pots to scrub. Your hands hurt, your back ached, but nothing stopped. You ate quietly if there was food, and slept quickly if you were allowed. And in the dark, your dreams were not escape, but of tasks left undone. You dreamed of forgetting something, of breaking something, of being asked to do something and failing, because that was the rhythm of your life. Wake, work, eat if you can, sleep if you're allowed, repeat, not because someone was punishing you, but because this was the only way to survive. The chores didn't end. They only waited for you to get up again. There was a time when you tried to remember every face, when every person who died felt like the end of the story you hadn't finished reading. But over time, the pages began to turn faster, and the names began to fade, not because you want to forget them, but because you had no choice. In your village, goodbyes came too often to be carried one by one. They came like the wind, quietly and without warning, sweeping away voices, footsteps, and entire lives, leaving behind only silence and a little more space around the fire. The first time someone died, you cried. You were young. It was your grandmother, or maybe a cousin, or maybe just an old man whose hands you had seen often but whose name you never learned. They wrapped him in cloth and buried him behind the hill, where the ground was soft enough to dig. There were no long speeches, no mourning clothes, no procession, just a hole in the earth, a few words said in low voices, and then the dirt returned to cover what had once been a person. And then it happened again. A woman in childbirth, a boy who fell through the ice, an elder who never woke up, a baby who never cried. And again, and again. Each time, the ritual was the same, brief, silent, necessary. There was no room for grief to bloom fully. It had to be pressed down, packed in tight like the soil, because the chores were waiting and the cold would not pause for your sorrow. You stopped asking why. The causes didn't matter. Fever, infection, accident, hunger, they all ended the same way. A missing seat, a quiet name, a set of tools no longer touched. You stopped crying, not because you felt less, but because there were too many tears and not enough time. Your body learned how to keep moving through the pain, how to keep your hands steady even when your chest felt hollow. There were days when you couldn't remember exactly who was gone, just that they had once been there. Someone who used to laugh a certain way. Someone who used to share bread. Someone who used to sing under their breath while hanging skins to dry. Their presence lingered only in fragments, in gestures others no longer made, in the way a task was now done slightly differently. Sometimes you caught yourself expecting them to walk through the door, to pass you by in the field, to call your name from across the stream. And when they didn't, when you remembered again that they were gone, you simply lowered your eyes and kept walking, because there were animals to feed, because the snow was falling, because the world did not stop turning, even when your heart did. You learned not to grow too close. You stopped naming the new children too early. You stopped asking about the sick. You listened carefully to the tone of someone's voice when they mentioned another village, because if their voice was too flat, it meant someone there had died too, and you carried those absences inside you like stones in your pocket, heavy but unspoken. You said goodbye too often. And the strange thing was, you rarely said the word at all. There was no formal farewell, no final hug, no whispered goodbye before someone disappeared from your life. They were there, and then they weren't, and what remained was silence. But even though you said goodbye without saying it, the weight of each absence still settled in your bones. It made your back a little heavier, your eyes a little quieter, your laughter a little slower to return. And still, you woke up each morning. You carried water. You chopped wood. You passed by the places where voices used to echo and didn't stop to listen, because that was how you lived, not in defiance of loss, but alongside it, not forgetting, but surviving anyway. They told you it was time, not with ceremony or a speech, but with a nod, a glance, a quiet gesture toward the weapon laid at your feet. There were no questions. No one asked if you were ready. No one offered to explain what you were about to do. You had grown tall enough. Your hands no longer looked like a child's, and that was enough. In your village, that was a measure of when a boy became something more, not in years, but in silence, in weight, in whether or not you hesitated when handed a blade. Your first battle was not a glorious moment. It was not the story the elders told beside the fire, not the sagas sung with pride. It was cold, muddy, and filled with the sounds of people trying not to die. There was no armor waiting for you, no polished sword forged with care. What you had was whatever could be found. An old axe head tied to a stick, a cracked shield barely wider than your chest, a knife someone had once used to skin goats. And you were told to stand, to walk, to follow the others. You didn't even know where you were going until you arrived. Another village, a feud, a warning unheeded. The reasons didn't matter. You had heard the names of the men you would fight, but they meant nothing. Just different accents, different clothes. They looked like your people. They were your people. And now you were meant to raise your weapon against them. Your heart beat too fast. Not in your chest, but in your throat, in your ears, in your fingertips. The air felt thick. The sky too low. The faces around you were hard, but their eyes were distant, already somewhere else. No one looked at you. No one wanted to see a boy standing where a fighter should be. When the fighting began, it didn't come all at once. It built slowly, like a storm you couldn't quite see, until suddenly the air was filled with shouting and the clash of metal and the scream of someone who had just realized this was real. You didn't move at first. You froze. Your feet felt like stone. Your fingers clenched the weapon so tightly they went numb. And then someone shoved you forward. You didn't remember your first strike, only the noise it made, the dull, heavy sound of wood against flesh, the way your arm jolted, the way the figure in front of you dropped. Not instantly, but slowly, like something had been taken out of them all at once. You didn't know if they died. You didn't stop to check, because someone else was coming. There was blood on your hands. You couldn't tell if it was yours. Your ears rang, but you couldn't hear your own breath. Everything moved too quickly and too slowly at once. You saw a man fall to his knees. You saw another stumble backward, clutching his side. You saw someone run. And for a moment, you almost did too. But you didn't, because your father was watching. Or maybe your brother. Or maybe no one. It didn't matter. You had to stay. Because running made you pray, and pray didn't survive. When it ended, no one cheered. No one raised their hands or shouted your name. The ground was littered with bodies, some moaning, some still, some already cold. You stood there, covered in dirt and sweat and fear, and felt something shift inside you. Not pride, not victory. Something smaller, quieter, a weight settling into your stomach that you knew would never leave. You walked back to your village with the others. No one spoke. No one looked at you. You passed the goats, the trees, the stream where you used to play, and nothing looked the same. You didn't eat that night. You didn't sleep either. You stared into the fire and listened to it crackle and wondered if the person you had been yesterday was still somewhere inside you, or if he had been left behind in the mud, beside the figure who hadn't gotten back up. They called it your first battle, but it wasn't a beginning. It was something you would carry forever, a mark no one could see, but that you would feel every time you touched the weapon you no longer wanted to hold. You didn't realize it had happened until much later, when the quiet moments became rare, when laughter felt unfamiliar, and when someone younger than you picked up a stick and called it a sword. You watched them play and felt something shift inside you, not envy, not even sorrow, just a distant ache of something that used to be yours, though you had never truly held it. Childhood, if it existed at all, had passed through you like a wind too fast to catch, leaving behind only fragments, shadows, echoes, fading traces of what could have been. You remembered a time when your hands were too small to carry a bucket, when your name was still said gently, when your questions were answered with a smile instead of silence. You remembered a game you once played with your brother, a game you no longer remembered the rules to. You remembered the way of a feather in your palm, the sound of rain on the thatched roof, the way the fire once seemed like a mystery instead of just another thing that had to be fed. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, because by the time you could walk, you were already working. By the time you could speak, you were already told when to be quiet. And by the time you could think for yourself, you were already carrying things too heavy for your age. Not just wood or water, but expectation, duty, silence, and the unspoken pressure survived without needing too much from anyone. There were no toys. There were tools. There were no days to explore. There were tasks. And even when you played, you imitated work. You copied the motions of your father swinging an axe, your mother grinding grain, the older boys sharpening blades. It wasn't pretend. It was practice. No one asked what you wanted to be. No one spoke of dreams. You were not being prepared for a future of your choosing. You were being shaped into someone useful, someone who could endure, someone who could be relied upon not because they were strong, but because they didn't complain when they were hurting. You learned to keep things inside. Your joy, your questions, your fears. You watched others do the same, and so you followed, because there was no reward for being soft. You were not punished for crying, perhaps, but you were taught that it served no purpose. That pain was better endured in silence. That hunger was better ignored. That emotions were something to be buried beneath layers of endurance. There were children younger than you who died before they ever spoke. There were others who grew quiet after a single winter. And you, who had lived this long, were considered lucky, not because your life was rich, but because it had not yet been taken. And so you kept going. You kept walking, working, waiting. Not for joy, not for rest, but for the next task, the next season, the next demand. One day, someone called you grown. They didn't say it with pride. They said it the way they might point to a tree and say it no longer bends in the wind. You didn't feel older. You didn't feel different. You just realized no one would carry anything for you anymore. Not the buckets, not the firewood, not your grief. And in that moment, you understood that you had never been a child in the way stories described. You had been small, yes, you had been young, but you had never been protected from the world, never been shielded from cold, from hunger, from death. You had never been free to wonder who you were, only taught who you must become. That was your childhood, a quiet chapter written between storms, a fragile echo inside a life that was already too heavy. You didn't lose your childhood. You never had the chance to keep it. You survived. That alone was supposed to mean something. You endured the cold, the hunger, the sickness, the silence. You outlived the fevers, the raids, the long nights when death felt like a second breath. You grew strong enough to carry weight, quiet enough to avoid attention, quick enough to keep pace with the rhythm of a life that never slowed down. You reached the other side of a childhood that never allowed you to be a child. And yet, when you looked in the mirror, if your village had such a thing, which it didn't, What stared back at you wasn't triumph or pride or peace. It was a face that had learned to hold itself still, a body that remembered how to move but had forgotten why. No one celebrated your survival. There was no gathering, no meal in your honor, no fire lit just for you. People noticed you less now, not because you had disappeared, but because you had become like them. Another figure moving to the chores, another pair of hands to lift and mend and carry. You were no longer watched. You were expected. You were no longer taught. You were assigned. You had proven yourself not by what you achieved, but by what you had endured, and by how little you spoke of it. You had your own tasks now. You filled your days not with questions, but with repetition. Feed the animals. Fix the tools. Watch the fire. Prepare the wood for the next winter, even though the last one still lived in your bones. You moved through the village with steps that had lost their urgency. There was no rush anymore, just routine, just the next day and the next and the next. But sometimes when you stood still, just for a moment, you felt the cost. It wasn't in your muscles, though they ached. It wasn't in your hands, though they were calloused and cracked. It was somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, in the way your heart no longer leapt when you saw something beautiful, in the way you forgot how to laugh without looking around first, in the way your thoughts avoided certain corners of memory, not because they were gone, but because they still burned. You had learned to keep going, but you had also learned to keep silent, to bury joy so deep it no longer fought to return, to tuck away grief like dried meat, kept for the hard days but never truly digested. You survived not by growing, but by hardening. And now, as you stood taller, your shoulders broader, your voice deeper, you wondered if the softest parts of you had been lost somewhere along the way. Others called it strength. They said you were a man now, that you were reliable, that you understood what it meant to be needed. But when they said those things, you didn't feel proud. You felt empty. Not always, but often enough to notice. And when you lay down at night, beneath the same roof that once trembled above your childhood fears, you didn't dream of battle or glory. You dreamed of quiet streams, of the friend you lost, of the goat you once named and never spoke of again. You dreamed of warmth, not just the kind that fire gave, but the kind that never came back after it left. You had made it, but sometimes survival isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just a silence that follows too long after everything else has fallen away. You walked forward. You did what needed to be done, and no one questioned that. But in the parts of you where the wind still crept in, you carried the cost. Not in scars, but in stillness. Not in wounds, but in all the words you never learned how to say. You survived, and maybe someday that will be enough.